Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. The United States and the Soviet Union were partners during World War II, but shortly thereafter their partnership fell apart as the two superpowers, with vastly different political systems and economic systems, looked at the world differently. That tension between these two countries is often remembered as the Cold War, which is the beginning of our new unit of Prosperity and Progress. In the course of this unit, you're going to watch Prosperity and Protest, although there is some progression in there. But anyway, in the course of this unit, you're going to watch the tensions of the international world get developed and concentrated at home as new tensions also erupt onto the American stage. So, dear student, incline your ear. Dang, that was a really good intro. We have 5 objectives today. It's a big one. By the end of this class, you should be able to explain the breakdown in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union after the war. You should be able to summarize steps taken to contain Soviet influence. You should be able to explain how conflicts over Germany increased the fear of Soviet aggression. And you should be able to explain how communists came to power in China and how the United States reacted. And lastly, you should be able to summarize the events of the Korean War. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. The United States and the Soviet Union had very different ambitions for the future in the years after World War II. These differences created a climate of icy tension that plunged the two countries into a bitter rivalry. Under Soviet-style communism, the government controlled all the property and all the economic activity of the country. But the capitalist system in the United States, citizens controlled basically all of the economic activity. In the American system, voting by people elected a president and a Congress from competing political parties. In the Soviet Union, there's one political party, and it's the Communist Party. It established a totalitarian government without any kind of an opposition or really any party competition. The United States distrusted the leader of the Soviet Union, a guy named Joseph Stalin, partly because he'd been an ally even of Hitler for a time. Stalin supported the Allies really only after Hitler reneged on his agreement and invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. In some ways, the Americans and the Soviet became more suspicious of each other during the war. Stalin resented the way that the Western Allies delayed in attacking the Germans in Europe, and then reactions worsened after Stalin learned that the United States had kept the atomic bomb a secret from them. They're like, hey, we're supposed to be allies. If there's any consolation, Harry Truman was vice president and didn't know about it till he got the keys to the White House. In spite of these problems, hope for world peace were at a height at the end of the war. The most visible symbol of these hopes was the creation of a new international body known as the United Nations. On April 25, 1945, representatives of 50 nations met in the city of San Francisco to establish this new peacekeeping body. Ironically, even though the United Nations was intended to promote peace, it soon became an arena in which the two superpowers would compete against each other. Both the United States and the Soviet Union used the United Nations as a forum to spread their influence over others. Subpoint C. For the United States, a key figure in the early conflict with the Soviets was President Harry S. Truman. Truman came into office when Roosevelt died and was thrust into the position, and that's really who the Soviets were dealing with. On April 12, 1945, Truman suddenly became president when Franklin Roosevelt died. This former Missouri senator had been picked as Roosevelt's running mate in 1944. He was not like a long-standing ally or even friend of Roosevelt. They came from different ends of the Democratic Party and really didn't have much in common. He served as vice president really for only a few months before Roosevelt's death. During his term as vice president, Truman hadn't been included in any top policy decisions. He didn't even know that the United States was developing an atomic bomb. Many Americans doubted Truman's ability to serve as president, but Truman was honest and he had a willingness to go make tough decisions. And those are qualities that were desperately needed during his presidency. Subpoint D. Truman's first test and really biggest test as a diplomat came in July of 1945 when the Big Three, the United States, Great Britain, and Stalin, met at a final wartime conference at Potsdam near Berlin. They had met a couple of times before, but here they had met in Berlin really at the end of the war. They were the countries that were the same ones that had participated in the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. Stalin, but the people have changed. Stalin's really like our only repeat person there. He had represented the Soviet Union both at Yalta and now at the Potsdam Conference. By this point, Winston Churchill was no longer the Prime Minister of England, so Clement Attlee came and replaced Churchill as Britain's representative mid-conference. Churchill's party lost election, and in the British system, if you're Political party doesn't make up the majority of the House of Parliament, you're no longer the prime minister, and that's what happened to Churchill. And then Harry Truman was taking over after Roosevelt's death from there. At Yalta, at the previous conference, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that he would allow free and fair elections. That is, he would allow voting to happen by a secret ballot in a multi-party system in Poland and in other eastern parts of Europe that the Soviets were occupying by the end of the war. By July of 1945, though, it was pretty clear that Stalin wasn't going to keep this promise. He'd either changed his mind or had never intended to keep it. The Soviets prevented free elections in Poland and outright banned competing political parties. Roman numeral number 2. Stalin's refusal to allow free and fair elections in Poland convinced Truman that the United States and the Soviet Union really had deeply, different views on the world. Truman's goal in demanding free and fair elections was to spread democracy to all nations that had been under Nazi rule. They want to make sure all these countries had the right of self-determination and their ability to go choose their own future. At the Yalta Conference, Soviets had wanted to take reparations from Germany to go repay Soviet wartime losses. Now, at Potsdam, Truman objected to that. It was hard bargaining, and it was agreed that the Soviets, the British, the French, and the Americans would take reparations payments basically from their own occupation zones, whatever part of the Nazi empire that they were occupying, that they would go and could get reparations from those areas. But that was it. Like, the whole country wouldn't be going and paying any particular country. Truman also felt that the United States had a large economic stake in spreading democracy and free trade across the globe. The United States was the economic leader of the world as a result of the post-time boom during the war. To continue growing, American businesses wanted access to raw materials in Eastern Europe. They wanted to be able to sell goods in Eastern European countries. But the Soviets were, at some point B, tightening their grip on Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war as an economically and militarily strong nation. So even though they had lost a whole bunch of people during the war also kind of galvanized their industry, not unlike the way it did in the United States as well. But the Soviet Union had suffered a lot greater devastation than the United States did, and had suffered it on their own soil. Soviet deaths from the war have been estimated at maybe 20 million people, half of whom were civilians and casualties of the war. As a result, the Soviets felt justified in their claim to Eastern Europe, feeling like they had earned it and could stop they also wanted to stop future invasions from the West, to keep some future similar to the Nazis from ever rivaling into the Soviet Union again. So Stalin installed communist countries, governments in the countries of Albania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. These countries became known as the Soviet Union's satellite countries. They weren't specifically the Soviet Union. They're independent countries, but they're pretty much controlled by the Soviet Union. They're pretty much like they're communist countries, and they report to their big brother in Russia. So they're independent, but only so independent. By early 1946, Stalin gave a speech announcing that communism and capitalism were incompatible and that another war was inevitable. Stalin was basically saying, like, our conflict with Americans are just getting started. Subpoint C. The United States approached like the Soviet Union now with their increasing militancy with a policy known as containment. And in 1946, the Truman administration began this policy where the United States essentially said, we don't think we want to go fight the Soviet Union by themselves. Like, we don't think we want to go attack communist Russia. But what we would like to do is to see that communism doesn't continue to spread. We wanted to see it contained. And so the United States tried to prevent any future extension of communist rule to other countries. Europe was now divided into two political regions, mostly democratic Western Europe and a mostly communist Eastern Europe. In March of 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States and gave a speech that described the situation in Europe. He actually gave it in Missouri, not far from St. Louis, and he writes, or he says at the speech, "A shadow has fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Beyond that line lie all the capitals and the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere and are all subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but also to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow." But that phrase in the middle of it, the Iron Curtain, it came to stand for the division of Europe. And when Stalin heard about the speech, he declared in no uncertain terms that Churchill's words, while it's a speech to people in Missouri. It was a call to war. Subpoint D. The United States first tried to contain Soviet influence in Greece and in Turkey. Great Britain was financially supporting both of these nations in the years after the war, and it was really to prevent their economies from going into total collapse. And when people saying, well, it looks like capitalism has failed here, let's go see what the communists are doing, and having communism come into Greece and Turkey, Great Britain said, no, this is a temporary blip and we can go help bail you out, and was trying to prop up the economies there. But Britain's economy had been badly hurt on its own by World War II, and the formerly wealthy nation could no longer afford to give aid to these allies. It asked the United States to take over the responsibility for the aid in Greece and Turkey. Truman agreed, and on March 12th of 1947, he asked Congress for $400 million in economic aid and in military aid for Greece and Turkey. In a statement known as the Truman Doctrine, he declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. By 1947 and 1950, the United States had sent $400 million in aid to Turkey and Greece, which greatly reduced the danger of a communist takeover in those two nations. Subpoint E. Like post-war Greece, there was a lot of Western Europe which was also in economic chaos. Most of its factories had been bombed or looted as a result of the war, and millions of people were living in refugee camps without even really permanent housing. In June of 1947, the Secretary of State, a guy named George Marshall, he proposed that the United States should provide aid to European nations that needed it, saying that the move was directed not against any country or doctrine. I think there's like a subtext here, like, hey, Soviet Union, we're not fighting you here, we're trying to help people. He says, it's not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger and poverty and desperation and chaos. The Marshall Plan basically took American money and gave it overseas to go prop up these countries so that they too don't have communist revolutions. And it revived European hopes. Over the next 4 years, 16 countries received somewhere around $13 billion in aid. And by 1952, Western Europe was flourishing, and the Communist Party really lost its appeal to voters. They said, why would we go side with this? It seems like capitalism is flourishing here. Roman numeral number 3. As Europe recovered, the United States and its allies clashed with the Soviet Union over how to now put back together Germany. It was divided into 4 zones, 4 occupation zones, but now the question was, how should German reunification go? Because the United States, Great Britain, and France and the Soviet Union all occupied different quarters of it. In 1948, Britain, France, and the United States combined their 3 zones into one country. The western part of Berlin had been occupied by the French and the British and the Americans, but it's actually the capital of the country now, of Berlin, was in the middle of the piece that was occupied by the Soviet Union. So although the 3 nations intended to unify their zones, they had no agreement with the Soviets to go like bring in that corner of the country as well. And so they basically ended up with this little enclave of a city of the 3 Western countries controlling the rest of the country, and then this like little speck of Berlin on one side that was West Berlin that would go with now the west part of Germany. But they didn't actually have an agreement with Stalin for how to go protect that little enclave over there, to guarantee free access by road or by rail to it. And Stalin saw this as like his opportunity. This was the loophole to go stick it to the west. And if he moved quickly, he said maybe we could just take over all of West Berlin, and that would be quite a catch because Berlin was an important city. In June of 1948, Stalin moved on that plan and closed all highway and rail routes into West Berlin. As a result, no food or fuel could reach that part of the city, and the 2.1 million residents of the city really only had enough food to last for approximately 5 weeks, and the thinking was that they would essentially give up and just join the rest of the Soviet occupation from there. But the resulting situation was really pretty dire. In an attempt to go break that blockade, the Americans and the British said, okay, well, the Soviets are put a blockade on the road and the rail, and we could probably go like force our way through it, but we're going to go cause like a conflict that way, and we don't want to spark a war with it. What else can we do? And so they began saying, aha, we have airplanes, and they started flying over the city of Berlin and essentially like pushing supplies out the back of the plane. And for 327 days, planes were taking off and landing really every few minutes around the clock. And over the course of, this is crazy, 277,000 flights, they brought into West Berlin 2.3 million tons of supplies, everything from food and fuel and medicine and Christmas presents. What was known as the Berlin Airlift assured that West Berlin would survive. The mission boosted American prestige around the world, and by May of 1949, the Soviet Union realized it was beaten, and instead of going and capturing West Berlin, what they've done was just make America the hero, make their own sworn enemy the hero, and they lifted the blockade, subpoint C. In the same month, the western part of Germany officially became a new nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, although everybody called it West Germany. That part included West Berlin, and even though West Berlin was totally surrounded by East Germany, it belonged to the western part of the country. A few months later, from its occupation zone, the Soviet Union created West Germany's rival, East Germany, officially known as the German Democratic Republic, which included East Berlin. So now the city of Berlin is divided into two parts, subpoint D. The Berlin blockade, while it was increasing Western Europeans' prestige in the world, it was also increasing Western Europeans' fear of the Soviet Union. As a result, 10 Western European countries, Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, and Norway, and Portugal, all joined with the United States and Canada on April 4th, 1949 to form a defensive military alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We know it better as NATO, NATO. The 12 members of NATO pledged military support to each other in case any member was attacked. And for the first time in the United States history, the United States entered a military alliance, but did so during peacetime. The Cold War had ended any hopes of Americans ever returning to isolationism, which had characterized so much of American foreign policy until this point. Now America was permanently committing to be involved in the world stage, peace or war. Greece and Turkey joined NATO in 1952. West Germany joined by 1955. By then, NATO kept a standing military force of more than 500,000 troops just stationed and ready to go with thousands of tanks and planes and other equipment as a standing army ready to fight into battle. Roman numeral number 4. Here we want to turn our eyes eastward towards the country of China. China was an ally of the United States during World War II, but that alliance fell apart when China itself fell into civil war. Because for 2 decades, the Chinese communists fought along the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. The United States supported this leader of China, Chiang Kai-shek, but between 1945 and 1949, the American governments were sending this nationalist government, this Chiang Kai-shek government, the allies of America had been sending them billions of dollars, $3 billion in aid over the course of a few years. And Americans were overall impressed with the leadership in China. Chiang Kai-shek, they were impressed by him and admired the courage and determination of the Chinese nationalists, especially in the resistance they showed against Japan during the war. However, the people that actually dealt with China had a different view, and they looked at Chiang with a different point of view. They said that he is actually running a really inept government that is hopelessly corrupt and just really inefficient, and they're the good guys, but not much of good guys. Furthermore, the policies of Chiang's government undermined nationalist support. For example, the nationalists collected a grain tax from farmers, even during the famine of 1944. When city dwellers demonstrated against a, get this, 10,000% increase in the price of rice, I mean, whoa. Suddenly food became extremely expensive. And city dwellers are the price is going up awful high on this. This doesn't, something is wrong. And they go and protest over this. Suddenly it gets very expensive to be alive in China. So they were protesting against a 10,000% increase in the price of rice. They're there was a grain tax. This is all government constructed. The government puts the tax on it that raises that price onto it. And that's why they're protesting. When they go protesting, Chiang's police go and shoot on the protesters, fire on their own people, on the protesters. That makes it hard to keep your alliance going with even a guy that you think of as the good guy. It's hard to keep calling him the good guy. On the other side, though, there are the communists. And we know Americans don't like communism spreading in China as well. So it's do you prop up the not very good guy because he's not communist, or do you allow the country of China, the most populous country in the world, become a communist country again? This really put Americans into a pickle spot. The communists were led by a guy named Mao Zedong, who gained strength through the country. In the areas that they controlled, the communists worked to go win peasant support. They encouraged peasants to go learn to read and to go help improve food production. And as a result, more and more recruits say, hey, who's actually making my life better? It's Mao Zedong and the communists. Became known as like the Red Army. That was Mao's army. By 1945, much of northern China was under communist control. When civil war erupted in China between these two sides, in spite of nationalist problems, American containment policy favored them. They're like, we don't really like Chiang Kai-shek, but it's a containment policy. We don't want communism to spread. So they ended up siding with Chiang Kai-shek. And from 1944 to 1947, the United States played peacemaker between the two groups while supporting the nationalists. However, the United States officials repeatedly failed to negotiate successful peace. In May of 1949, Chiang and the remnants of the government just had to go leave altogether. The Civil War had pushed the nationalists entirely out of China into the little island of Taiwan, just right off the coast. There, after more than 20 years of struggle, communists ruled all of mainland China, where they established a brand new government that's called the People's Republic of China, which is currently the government of China, the Republic of China. So this is confusing. You have the People's Republic of China, the PRC. That's China the way we think of China. And then there is the similarly named Republic of China. The ROC is Taiwan. Taiwan is not its official name. Taiwan is the name of the island. The country is called Republic of China, although everybody calls it Taiwan. It's the name of the island. It's confusing because there's the People's Republic of China that is China. But anyway, you've got Communist China now under Mao Zedong, and you've got Nationalist Republic of China, Taiwan, which is held under Chiang Kai-shek. Roman numeral number 5. Let's turn now to the Korean Peninsula, where Japan had taken Korea. They actually captured it back in 1910, before World War I, and they had ruled it until August of 1945. As the war ended, Japanese troops north of, basically like the 38th line of latitudes, the 38th parallel, like, the longitude, latitude of the globe. Imagine 38th up from the equator. It runs right through the middle of more or less of Korea. And so in the north of about there, Japanese troops surrendered to the Soviets, the Allies. They surrendered to the Allies, but the Soviet army. Just south of the 38th parallel, the Japanese army there surrendered to the Allies, but to American troops south of that parallel. Just like in Germany, the two sides of that peninsula, the two sides of that land were divided up, and essentially the Soviets established a communist-style provisional temporary government in the north, and the Americans established a American-style democratic capitalist country in the south. In 1948, the Republic of Korea, which is South Korea, established a zone by the United States. Its capital was based in Seoul, South Korea, which was like Korea's traditional capital. Simultaneously, the communists start the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, and its capital was in Pyongyang, and it was led by a guy named Kim Il-sung. Soon after the war, the United States had cut back its forces in South Korea. By June of 1949, there was really like 500 American troops. They were there really, like, not even a protection force, it's more of an advisory force. The Soviets concluded that the United States now had no real way and no real interest in defending South Korea, so they planned to take back North Korea. So the Soviets basically say, we're going to take North Korea, which we put up as a temporary government. We'll just take the whole thing, communist, boom. And then we will go and take South Korea while we're there. We'll send in the tanks and airplanes and money in an attempt to go take over the entirety of the peninsula. Subpoint B. 16 countries wanted to go prevent this and sent in 520,000 troops in aid of South Korea. Over 90% of these troops were Americans. South Korean troops numbered an additional 590,000, so we're talking over a million, 1.2 million people to go protect South Korea. And they were combined under the command of World War II hero General Douglas MacArthur, whom we met in our last unit. He's the I shall return people of the Philippines, right? Like, he's that guy, and now he's commanding troops in South Korea to go defend against the communist invasion. At first, North Korea seemed to be totally unstoppable. They would just drive and push steadily south, and its troops captured even the capital of South Korea. They captured Seoul. After a month of bitter combat, North Koreans had forced the United Nations and South Korean troops into a small defensive zone right around Pusan in the southeast quarter of the peninsula. There, MacArthur launched a daring and exciting counterattack with tanks and heavy artillery and fresh U.S. troops pushing in. There, on September 15th of 1950, his troops made a surprise amphibious landing behind their lines at Incheon on Korea's west coast, and other troops moved north from Busan, and so you have like Americans are landing in the north and heading south, and Americans are pushing up from the south, heading north, and the trap between two attacking forces, about half of North Korean troops fell and just surrendered, and the rest fled back across the 38th parallel. MacArthur's plan had basically saved his army from almost certain defeat. The MacArthur magic looked like it was going to work again. The UN army then chased the retreating North Korean troops across the parallel, across 38th parallel into North Korea, and in late November, UN troops approached the Yalu River, a border between North Korea and China, and it seemed as if Korea was about to become a single country again, now in the model of American democratic capitalism and pushing all the Soviets out altogether. And then in subpoint C, the side we didn't see coming, the Chinese join up with the Soviets because like communist buddies, they come in and they late by subpoint C in late November of 1950, 300,000 Chinese troops joined the war on the side of the North Koreans, and the Chinese wanted North Korea as a communist buffer state to prevent basically to protect Manchuria, and they felt threatened by the American fleet that lay just off the coast. The fight between North Korea and South Korea escalated into a war where the main opponents were not, this is important to remember, the main opponents in the Korean War were not the North Koreans and the South Koreans, but actually the Chinese and the Americans. The Chinese aided by the Soviets and the Americans. This is sometimes called a proxy war, because the two sides that are ostensibly fighting aren't actually fighting. It's two other groups that are using the conflict to do their own fighting for them. So the main opponents were the Chinese and the Americans. By the full force of numbers, because China could throw some manpower at this, Chinese troops drove the UN southward, and by early January of 1951, all United Nations and South Korean troops had been pushed almost altogether out of North Korea. The Chinese advanced to the south and recaptured Seoul. For 2 years, neither side was able to make important advances. To break the stalemate, in 1951, MacArthur called for an extension of the war into China. They say, okay, if we're really going to go take the Korean Peninsula, we've got to get the Chinese out of it. And the way we got to get the Chinese out of it is to basically declare war onto China. That will distract their troops, and they will move up through, out of the peninsula, back onto the Chinese mainland, and we can go and set up and secure the peninsula there. And he said, to make sure that this is going to work, we got to go, back into the storage closet and go grab another one of those atomic bombs. We drop one of those things on China, hey, they're going to surrender. They will surrender. That's the MacArthur plan. Truman said, no, we're not going to do that. And he rejected his request. Said, I'm the one that gets to control the keys to the atomic bomb. We've used them twice in Japan. That is enough. If just let China know we have them, but no, you're not going to use atomic bombs. Attacking China, he said, could set off World War III, and China themselves have so much manpower that we just cannot go fight another war. You're not going to go set off World War III in China. MacArthur, the answer is no. Instead of attacking China, the United States and South Korean forces began to advance again, and by April of 1951, they successfully retook Seoul. They retook Seoul, South Korea, and it moved back up again to the 38th parallel. The situation by April of 1951 was exactly the same as the beginning of the Korean War. Essentially, there's two countries, the 38th parallel divides them, and they're both angry at each other. Subpoint D. Speaking of angry at each other, certain that he was correct, Douglas MacArthur tried to go over the president's head. He basically said the president has the bully pulpit, but MacArthur says, I've got a bit of a bully pulpit myself. The Americans love me. I'm a hero of World War II. I'm maybe the finest military mind on earth today, and it has real cachet to it. And so he decided to go over the president's head. He spoke and wrote privately to the press, tried to drive up media support. And to Republican leaders, they said, hey, Truman's a Democrat. Let's go get his political opponents to go push for an atomic attack as well. MacArthur had no authority to make wartime policy decisions. That is the role of the president. The president is the commander-in-chief. He is constitutionally the one who makes this decision, not MacArthur. But that is the role of the president. And despite repeated warnings, MacArthur, back off of this. He refused to stop. He just continued to criticize the president. The thing about Truman is that Truman was, while he was willing to make tough decisions, he was also willing to stand by them and was incredibly stubborn. He was as stubborn as MacArthur was and refused to stand for any of MacArthur's behavior. He wanted to put together a settlement of war, and he would no longer tolerate his top military commander questioning and sabotaging his policy at every turn. On April 11th of 1951, President Truman announced he had fired MacArthur. He'd fired the most important general, the most brilliant military mind in a generation, and he was out of work now. Americans were kind of outraged, actually, kind of like, MacArthur had a lot of cachet. A public opinion poll at the time of the firing showed that 70% of Americans sided with MacArthur on this. Guys, I don't think Americans, like 70% of Americans, agree on anything. But they sided with MacArthur. They said, no, Truman's wrong on this one. When MacArthur returned to the United States, he was invited to go address Congress. The guy just got fired by the president, and Congress is like, hey, you want to come and give a speech? And there he, that's like heads of government might get that, not just like fired generals. In his closing remarks to Congress, MacArthur, who really had a way of like giving punchy, rhetoric, a punchy line, he said, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." Public opinion eventually swung to the view that the war should be limited, and that Truman, while they, initially disagreed, maybe Truman had done the right thing. As a political figure, MacArthur did just fade away. Subpoint E. The Soviet Union unexpectedly suggested a ceasefire on June 23, 1951. Truce talks began in July of 1951, and both sides reached an agreement on the location of a ceasefire line at the existing battle line and establishing a demilitarized zone between two sides. Essentially, the 38th parallel, that which had divided the country since the Japanese surrender, was going to be the line upon which they were going to divide the country. By July of 1953, the two sides signed an armistice ending the war. At best, it was a stalemate. On one hand, North Korean invaders had been pushed back, and communism had been contained without the use of atomic weapons. On the other hand, Korea was still two nations. It was still two different countries instead of one. On the home front, what did Americans consider about the Korean War? It had cost 54,000 American lives and $67 billion in expenditures. The high cost of this ultimately unsuccessful war was one of the many factors that led Americans to reject the Democratic Party in 1952 and instead elect a Republican administration under World War II hero Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower actually, until he runs for president, doesn't really have a political career. He's a military man. He wasn't even a member of either party. Thought it was unfitting for a general to have a political opinion. But right after the war, once he becomes civilian Eisenhower, both parties swoop in to court him, the Republicans land him, and he's the man that wins in 1952. In addition, the Korean War increased the fear of communist aggression and prompted a hunt for Americans who might be blamed for any communist gains. That question of how is America going to address communism at home is really kind of the dominating story of the next few pieces of modern U.S. history, and it's a story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.